we're finding then is that there's just a real, what would you say, confusion among the scientific community. I mean, they say one thing, but then they say another thing. They have really no way to back up this assumption, a big assumption, which is the Big Bang Theory.
Well, not only that, that's correct, but remember they had to first of all invent this new idea of expanding space. Then they had to invent the idea that the wavelengths were going to expand in the expanding space. And, you know, as we talk about it today, we see contradictions. But you ask the question, we may ask the question, for example, people like me, as I was taking cosmology years ago, what do they say today about this particular topic of the wavelengths expanding, about universe expanding, and so forth? If it's unusual today as we're talking about it, and it is, then how do they go about convincing the graduate students that indeed it's reasonable or rational?
Yeah.
And that's what we want to pick up right now. Again, we want to look at the slide right here, the graphic, and see again Big Bang science fiction about redshift, but we want to then notice that indeed it says that the galaxies in the first box there on the left, you know, are at a certain distance apart. Then the space expands and the galaxies are further apart. Space expands again and galaxies are even further apart. In other words, they're saying that galaxies are expanding everywhere, so everywhere, no matter where you go in the universe, everything is expanding away from you. They're assuming that indeed the galaxies are moving apart, and yet they're maintaining their size and shape.
So space is expanding according to them, but the galaxies are not expanding. I mean, the galaxies are moving apart, but they're not going like this.
That's right.
Okay.
Now, that raises a very, very simple question. What is it that is happening to begin with for galaxies to form? Well, initially, remember we read that indeed Truffle is saying we really don't have a good explanation for the origin of galaxies. But more than that, the fact of the matter is they have to assume that galaxies form because stars form first. How did the stars form? Well, in the Big Bang, you know, you've got this huge amount of matter that's floating around the universe, and some places gravity is going to cause a certain amount to begin to condense. And sooner or later, more and more condenses because more and more gets together. Gravity then is presumably going to cause a huge accumulation, and it's going to produce a star. That's the idea. Well, remember this also, that in the Big Bang, the amount of matter that you have to begin with is just hydrogen and helium. That's all that supposedly was produced in the Big Bang. But stars today, you know, have all sorts of elements. We here on the Earth are the presumed result of the Big Bang accumulating the Earth and us coming from the Earth. Earth has got 92 elements. And so the question is, if it's only hydrogen and helium to begin with, how do you get all these other elements? Well, basically what they say is, well, in the universe we see that stars are blowing up, supernova. And in the universe we actually see indeed that when this happens, neutron reactions take place, are added to existing atoms, and they produce heavier nuclei, heavier elements. And so supernova occurs, and so presumably then heavier elements are produced. But one supernova is not ever going to do the trick to get all the elements that we have. So they have to assume the supernova will blow up, and it'll spew its contents to the vast reaches of the universe. And then some way, somehow, another one would do the same thing, spewing its contents to the vast reaches of the universe. And then some way, somehow, all this expanding matter is going to start reaccumulating again to make a second-generation star and then a first-generation star. And then, of course, the Earth presumably comes as a result of all sorts of things happening to the proto-nebular solar nebula, and then we have supposedly this round ball, the Earth billions and billions of years ago, cooling down. The question is, if indeed gravity is causing things to come together to begin with in this first star, the first stars, now we're going to have expansion causing the gravity, we have now expansion causing the galaxies to separate. But why is it that the same expansion that is now causing the galaxies to separate, which is they're made of the ordinary matter that we're made of and the stars are made of, how come the galaxies didn't expand? How did galaxies form to begin with if indeed there is this expansion and is causing all the matter to separate in the universe? And so how do the cosmologists actually respond to that? Well, look at this. Now, this is an example we showed in the video. And it's an example taken from one of the most famous books in cosmology, written by Mr. Thorne and Wheeler. And they basically said what we're going to do is demonstrate the best example they have now. This is the very best example they have as to show how galaxies will move apart. They put pennies, they say, glued on a balloon, they blow it up. And they're going to say, notice that the pennies remain the same size. But in the video, remember we said that indeed we quoted from this particular book, and it said they admitted that in trying to convince the graduate students that expansion was really something real, the graduate students were continually having difficulty. How can you expand everything? What's causing the expansion? They don't ever answer the question, but they simply say, well, here's an analogy. Here's something that's a good example. Well, what we've just got through saying, however, is that if you look at it just from simple common sense, and the very fact is that expansion is going to what? Cause galaxies to separate? That means it's overcoming the gravitational pull of one galaxy to another. Remember the galaxies that we saw that were the mice galaxies? Mm-hmm. Two very, very closely packed galaxies? You see, that should never be the case.
They should be apart from each other.
Everybody should be apart from everybody else in terms of the galaxies, but there they are. And so they say, well, it's an exception, except the fact of the matter is, there are all sorts of exceptions where galaxies are seen very, very close together.
I see.
Tadpole galaxies, mice galaxies, all sorts of galaxies are very, very close together. And in fact, you see, by their own theory, this shouldn't be the case. They're not admitting that. They simply say, well, exception, exception, exception. Anyway, I was looking into this, and I found there was another book written by a very, very prominent cosmologist. And in that book, he has another kind of example. And that other kind of example relates to the graphic we're seeing on the screen right now.
Okay.
He's basically saying we got a projector, and we're going to then project, you know, a small picture onto a screen.
Okay.
And we see then that the galaxies are there. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now we're going to move the screen. And actually, I will put a third screen back of the second screen there. And we see then what's happening is that indeed what is happening? The galaxies are what?
Expanding.
The galaxies themselves are expanding.
Because they get bigger with magnification.
That's right. And the very fact of the matter is, if you're going to expand anything against gravity, you can't just pick out expanding the galaxies themselves and pulling them apart. You can expand everything. Now this very, very clear-cut graphic is in another one of the books on cosmology. And this cosmologist, who is a Big Bang cosmologist, simply puts it in there and says, this is the way it is. And puts it in there and says, this is the way that expansion works. Well, I thought, wait a minute. Somebody, you know, is not doing any thinking. Because if that's the way expansion works, and they actually admit it, that's common sense. And so if you were to move the screen back further and let the expansion continue, which is what they've said has been going on.
It should get further apart, and the galaxies should burst.
There would be no galaxies at best. There would have been no galaxies to begin with, or if they ever formed, they're going to...
So let me go back to the balloon illustration just to make it clear for me.
Okay.
That balloon illustration is basically not valid because the gravitational forces that pull the pennies apart, so to speak, would also pull the pennies apart. I mean, separate the pennies one from another would actually act on the things, presumably copper and as it's put together, it would pull those apart as well. They would all expand. Not only the balloon, but also the pennies would expand, and ultimately there would be no pennies.
All the galaxies you see there on this particular schematic, of course, of the graphic, are simply bits of particles, stars, that are presumed to be held together by gravitational forces.
Right.
Expansion is said to be pulling the galaxies apart, which are bound by gravitational forces. So any sophomore in physics should be able to say, you know, if you're going to do that, everything should come apart. And so that's why we have this other graphic here in the video.
Shows them pulling apart.
And so it just goes to pieces.
Has anyone responded to that argument?
Absolutely not. In fact, we presented that, David and I did, down at the American Physical Society meeting down in Tampa in April of 2005. And people were there, physicists were there, and they were saying, wait a minute, something's wrong. And they say it's got to stay together. Everything's got to stay together. You can't expand the galaxies. I said, why not? It's all just gravity. If expansion is working to separate galaxies are held together by gravity, why aren't the galaxies themselves?
And they had no
going
answer
apart?
for that.
No. You know, what I'm saying is, it's a brainwash situation.
Except for that one scientist where you showed the screen.
That's right.
And was that gentleman there?
No.
He was not there.
He wrote the book, but I borrowed the material from that and put it in the schematic just to show that indeed, you know, we've got something from the world of physics and so forth. If you just go and look carefully, you find the contradiction on your own.
So then Big Bang is kind of collapsing. If you look at its contradictions, it's not working.
That's right. Well, now, that's only part of the story. For example, again now, let's get back to why it was Hubble and why are the others, you know, basically not cooperating here. Why are they opposing, of course, the idea of the center? And here's what it says. Hubble well knew that in earlier times the concept of Earth at or near the center of the universe, or its universal center, was associated with God, and obliquely refers to this on page 50 of his book, where he argues against the Earth occupying a unique position in the universe, likening it to the ancient concept of a central Earth. I believe Hubble's opposition was traceable in part to the event in 1799 when Napoleon inquired of the famous French scientist Simon Laplace. Laplace was of equal stature almost with Newton.
Mm-hmm.
Why his astronomy treatise, Laplace's astronomy treatise, made no mention of God? That's what Napoleon asked. Laplace answered, I have no need of that hypothesis. He just simply said, I'm wiping God off the picture. I can do it all by mathematics. And I said, I believe this set the stage for future astronomers, including Hubble, to exclude God from the universe whenever they wished.
Well, that's exactly the same thing that Stephen Hawking did.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So let's go from there. Now, this poster I was telling you about a few minutes ago is this poster presented at the American Physical Society meeting there in Tampa, April 2005. And you can see at the top, upper series of panels there, that indeed I included not only the balloon illustration, but I included the other panels there showing that indeed everything will go to pieces.
So this pulled it all together so they could see what you're saying in one graphic.
And I felt it was necessary, you know, to do that at the APS. I've been going to the APS meetings for a number of years, presenting all this, but I thought this particular poster, you know, would sort of pull it all together.
Did anyone out of all those physicists come up and say, you've caused me to think, I really have to think this through?
They didn't say it, but they were standing aside pondering. They would look and look and look and come over and then ask me a question and go back and ponder some more and then leave. Actually, a couple of years ago in the previous APS meetings, again, I had a different poster and again said the same thing. We'll be talking a little bit more about that, where I pointed out these contradictions, you know, and a whole series of physicists would come by and look at the poster, 4 by 8 feet, you know, and then read it for a while and just walk on. Just walk on. In other words, the mentality, the mindset of the physics and astrophysics community is such that this can't be true. Or if it is true, we don't want to know about it situation.
Okay.
See right there in the center and the lower portion there, fingerprints of creation. The reason I put that in there is to help those who came and were questioning how can all this be. I said, well, it's not only the Big Bang is wrong, but the appendage of the Big Bang, which is geological evolution of the Earth. I said we've already done work on that and have already found that indeed within the framework of Earth's crustal rocks, the granites, there is this evidence of very, very rapid creation.
Now, I mean, we've talked for a good bit of time here on the subject, you know, in the studio, and you've laid out, gone through all the science, talked about the eminent scientists who are showing all these different things. Was that available to them as they looked?
No,
physicists?
the only thing that was available to the ones who were
was
at the
the
poster,
conclusion.
was the poster there.
It's very clear that the scientists, what they're saying, if you hold them to it, it's not consistent with itself, and mixing and melding of theories together to get rid of a conclusion that's unwanted, you know, that's a real problem.
Let me just talk briefly about this book, Creation's Tiny Mystery. It's the story then, the odyssey of the publication in scientific literature of evidence for Earth's rapid creation of the granite rocks the foundation rocks of the Earth. We found evidence. What you see there on the graphic is this bullseye pattern formed by the result of the decay of radioactive particles that existed for only a short period of time and then disappeared. What does it do? What is the meaning of it all? It's all been published in the open scientific literature. It's been peer-reviewed, analyzed, unrefuted after decades of work to show that indeed, instead of the Earth evolving over billions of years, it was the result of very, very rapid creation. I testified to it at the Arkansas creation trial in 1981. Lots and lots of scientists were then made aware of it because it became public. And in any event, the reaction, however, since that particular time has been such that the scientific community, the editors who were accepting my papers for publication prior to the time of my testimony there at the Arkansas trial, and I actually made the discoveries there, most of them, while I was a guest scientist at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for 13 years. Anyway, my papers were published, they were analyzed, peer-reviewed, but when we came out there at the Arkansas trial, basically, they said, wait a minute, we got to put the clamps on this guy, and this is what they've done. So rocks then, such as El Capitan, we would classify, they have these unusual, what we call radial halos, special radial halos formed by the result of activity that existed only a short period of time and then disappeared. El Capitan is a created rock, something that was called into existence when the Earth was created. And as a result of that, we've also looked into the topic of the age of the Earth, and you can see we've done a DVD on that, The Young Age of the Earth. We'll give you information about where they can be obtained. And then, of course, this is the region of Mount Sinai. I wanted to emphasize this because Mount Sinai, a whole region over there, regardless of whether this is the Mount Sinai or not, this is the one that's presently identified. All in this region basically is granite, 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 granite. And from the standpoint of what we're saying, these special halos are found in granite rocks all over the world. In fact, I've looked at granite from this particular area. It also has these very special halos. And the point I'm making here is that when Moses was told the second time to make the 10 Commandments, you know, now I can write all of them. First time they were given to him, he picked up rocks from this Sinai Peninsula, granite rocks, and so God essentially wrote the 10 Commandments on the very, very rocks that he inscribed his record of creation to begin with.
And then also now, looking at the cosmos, there's going to be something that will marshal all this material so they can look at that as well.
He not only left fingerprints of creation in the Earth, but also, yes, in the cosmos. Those who are interested can go to halos.com and get more information about how you can obtain this material.
Now we want to move then from the scientific case that you've made for the, number one, confusion among scientists,
yes,
and the breaking of all those principles that we've gone through, whether it be not following the Doppler effect to its rational conclusion, whether it be going against conservation, whether it be looking at the model that they use to explain expansion with those waveforms and everything, and seeing the lunacy of that, not only by looking at it, but also by documenting what scientists have themselves said about it.
That's right.
We want to move from those, those elegant scientific facts, which are really undisputed by people like Stephen Hawking and others when you really look closely at what they're saying. And we want to look at another source of authority that they have actually, specifically in the comments that you share with us, have attempted to deny, and that is the biblical account, or what we would call the Bible, or the source of authority coming from divinity, sometimes called revelation. We want to look at the revealed truth, and you want to lead us through that.
Well, that's right. Remember, my initial, the beginning of this search was one in which, I'm looking to see if there's anything out there at all that would in any way affirm the Genesis record of the fourth commandment. I had no idea at all anything existed. And so in the process of doing this, these things, as we continue to work, I'll be frank with you, obviously, I entered into it with you know, wondering what in the world is there, if there is anything. But at the same time, Pat and I, my wife and I, kept praying, Lord, show us, lead and guide and direct us. So everything that we're seeing today, the result of it, of course, is a result of prayer, and we believe God's leading and directing. I mentioned a few minutes ago that indeed I was at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory for 13 years as a guest scientist. I was in the Lord's providence. I went and testified about the evidence for the fingerprints creation in the Earth's basement rocks. Scientists at the laboratory got upset with me, and then I've been working independently since that time. But anyway, the thing that occurred to me at the time I really realized the implications of these halos for creation was the passage here in Psalm 33, 6 and 9. By the word of the Lord were the heavens made, all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He spake, it was done, he commanded, and it stood forth. Now,
which goes along right with the idea that when you look at the granites, the polonium halos there can only be explained through an instantaneous event.
You know, this dumbfounded me. I stood in awe with the day I was looking at the halos under the microscope, wondering for years how to explain them myself. I couldn't fit them into the picture of evolutionary development of the Earth because the melt that supposedly formed the granites was cooling over millions of years, and you got something there that had to have formed as a result of activity that just was a fleeting existence. And then this particular passage in the Bible, these
made perfect sense. Hebrews 1:10 was the other one. In the beginning, O Lord, you laid the foundations, which of course would be the granites. Those are the foundation stones you're suggesting.
Right.
The foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. Well, that not only looks at creation's tiny mystery, but it also lays the foundation to say cosmology. Also, God would have something to say about it.
That's right. And this work on the halos, the Earth, was done over a period, you know, like 15, 20 years. And then it came to me, it recognized that indeed, well, this really wasn't the solution to the whole issue of the heavens are the work of your hands. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth. So I turned my attention to the universe. And I had, you know, this long time before I began to understand the essence of what was out there in the universe, because, again, I had to plow through a lot of assumptions which I had accepted, which I didn't really realize were just plain rank assumptions. Now, this cosmic model of the universe, we're going to talk just a minute about that. We now have, at least we'll assume just for a moment, there is a center of the universe, increasing redshift. The further you go away from the center, the redshift increases, increasing distance, and so forth. Now, out the very edge there, you're going to see something that says this is an outer shell of pre-Genesis galaxies. We're going to talk about that in just a little while. But for right now, the center of the universe, basically what we're saying is that the totality of the evidence, once we again show more about why the Big Bang expansion hypothesis is incorrect.
And I mean, make it clear, I mean, the scientists are very inconsistent and illogical with the Big Bang theory. And so what you're suggesting is, just like happened with creation's tiny mystery, there is probably a better, more dependable source of authority that you can look at to explain the cosmos. And it doesn't do violence to the science. So you're not saying science is not important,
right,
but you're saying the evidence of science fits more aptly, just as it did with looking at the granites, now with cosmology, when looking at the biblical text.
That's right. Actually, we'll see in just a little while that the scientific papers that I've written and try to get out to the scientific community even show more so that this whole expansion idea, you know, is based on a false assumption, not a correct assumption, meaning that the universe is formatted or governed by a static solution of the field equations, not the expanding space-time solution. So it makes it impossible that space-time expansion could explain anything. Everything in the Big Bang collapses because of this experimental evidence, which we'll be talking about.
Okay, and that's what you and David have done.
That's right.
And you're going to cover that.
That's right.
But what are the texts that kind of guide you with the center?
Well, let's look at these right here. Once, you know, we look at the Bible and we see from this schematic, this graphic right here, that indeed the galaxies really are moving away from a center. And the shell-like form there.
That's the evidence, from the Doppler effect
right.
we can see.
Now, if we look at the Bible, we find, several passages here that really very, very strongly suggest that indeed this has been in the Bible all the time. That, in other words, the structure of the universe is really there. Who alone stretches out the heavens, in Job. He's stretching out the heaven like a tent curtain, in Psalm 104. Who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and it spreads them out like a tent to dwell in, Isaiah 40. He has stretched out the heavens, Jeremiah 10. I am the Lord who made all things, who stretched out the heavens alone. I mean, they're just all over the place. It is he who made the earth by his power and by his understanding, stretched out the heavens. Looks like to me the Lord is trying to, the Bible especially, is just emphasizing how many times the Lord wants to say stretched out. My hand laid the foundation of the earth. This, in my opinion, is
putting those two again together.
That's right. Laid the foundation of the earth, creating the earth. My right hand spread out the heavens, creation of the heavens. When I call them, they stand forth. Together. And I made the earth. It was my hands that stretched out the heavens. What is your take on those?
Well, I would get the sense that he stretched out the heavens.
Pretty hard to deny.
Yeah.
Especially since, indeed, we find that, indeed, this whole idea of everything moving away from everything else, if you are stretching out something, it implies, in my opinion, you got to stretching out from a given location. Here is just a sort of a preview of this new cosmic model. And we're saying, of course, there is a center. The galaxies are moving out. We identify this outer shell of ancient pre-Genesis galaxies. What in the world is that all about? Well,
that could be pretty controversial right there, perhaps.
That could be very, very controversial.
Pre-Genesis galaxies.
Yeah.
I want to hear what you have to say about that.
All right. We have to lay
we'll lay a foundation and we'll get to that.
Some more scientific foundation before we can get there. Well, again, remember, this is our cosmic orbiting background explorer telling us, of course, that we have this microwaves coming in from the outer reaches of the universe. Remember what we said earlier, that the black body spectrum here has been identified experimentally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times.
How does that help us then?
All right. So I'm saying that, if the Big Bang expansion hypothesis is wrong, and remember we said earlier that indeed this cosmic black body radiation is supposedly relic radiation from the huge Big Bang fireball, but if the expansion doesn't even exist, then it could never have, first of all, if the Big Bang didn't exist, there would have been no fireball. But even if the fireball supposedly did exist, if you don't have expansion, you can never get this relic radiation. Meaning that if expansion wasn't true, and you did have a Big Bang for some reason, supposedly, just in theory, then what would be the radiation, what would be the level of the radiation today? Well, the level of the radiation would never have changed. Pardon me. The frequency or the wavelength of the radiation would never have changed. We see what? Light from the sun. It would be like the light from the sun just all over the universe. In other words, the radiation would never have diminished in frequency, increased in wavelength. So therefore, it would never have what? Lost energy. It would never have then gone from a brilliant, brilliant light from the sun-like to what we see today, which is basically the microwave region. Now, that's important for us to understand that if you don't have space-time expansion, if indeed there is no evidence for space-time expansion, no evidence for space-time expansion expanding the wavelengths, then people can talk about this relic radiation or the cosmic black body radiation being associated with the relic radiation from the Big Bang. But if those two facts are wrong, those assumptions are wrong, there's no way that you can get cosmic black body radiation from anything connected with the Big Bang.
Okay.
Fundamental, it's gone. So the two basic, huge, supposedly, ideas or discoveries that were the foundation of the Big Bang, the Hubble relation, and now the cosmic black body radiation, can't be true. There's got to be another explanation. So where did I look?
Yeah.
Well, to tell you the truth, I prayed for years. And indeed, knowing as I do, though, as a physicist, that the black body radiation comes from, an enclosure. If you happen to be inside the black box, or if you happen to be inside of the box, then you would measure the same radiation spectrum, whether you're inside or just a little hole coming out of it. So I thought, is there any way in the world that, you know, the universe could be
a closed system.
there'd be an enclosure of some kind. And I thought, what in the world? Nothing is like that has ever been considered before. And so I continued to pray, and you see, not only in devising, if you know something is wrong, and you know that the explanation of all these phenomena in astrophysics, the Hubble relation, the blackbody radiation, all sorts of 8 or 9 or 10 of them that have been explained presumably by the Big Bang, it's got to have another explanation. And so, obviously, it was wondering, what is the new model of the universe like?
So you prayed about it, you thought about it, you said, where
That's right.
do I look, and where
right.
did you look? What was your impression, and what did you find?
Well, just as the case, for example, and it occurred to me about the implications of the polonium halos being evidence for creation.
And you looked at all the granites, and you researched that.
I was looking under the microscope one day, and those
Found that.
passages, Psalm 33, 6, and 9, came to my mind. I go out and walk, and I wonder, what about the cosmic blackbody radiation? What about the cosmic blackbody radiation? Because it was said, no, nothing else in the universe can explain except the Big Bang. Anyway, the thought occurred to me that indeed there was an outer shell of galaxies. What does that mean, an outer shell of galaxies? Well, if an outer shell of galaxies and you're only dealing with ordinary matter, ordinary gravity, then the light from the outer shell of galaxies would come down to the Earth, and it would all be blue shifted. So if you had galaxies out there and they were shining, the light would be blue shifted. Now it would be an intensely hotter, higher, brighter than it was out there. But since the days of Einstein, and you know, I was into reading and studying all this, when Einstein first developed his theory and tried to apply it to the cosmos, but it turns out when he did that he couldn't balance everything. Gravity seemed to be pulling everything in. Well, maybe there is another force in the universe that we don't know anything about. Maybe there is what he called it a cosmological constant. Now, what that means is, what he was really saying is, maybe there is a force of gravity different than the ordinary gravity that we know about, and that's a gravity from this other feature of the universe, which we physicists thus far don't know anything about. So he invoked that and said, this is the cosmological constant. Well, later on, it turns out that indeed that feature of the universe was actually discovered.
Who discovered that?
Oh, this was discovered not necessarily one person, experiments. It was theorized since his day, but then experiments were done the last 15, 20 years, very, very precise, delicate experiments to actually show that this vacuum gravity does exist. It's a feature of the universe. Einstein entertained the idea of the cosmological constant to stabilize the universe until Hubble made his discovery. And at that particular time, Hubble said the universe, is expanding. So Einstein threw up his arms and said, biggest mistake I've ever made in my life is to invoke this idea of, the cosmological constant or this unknown vacuum gravity. Now, the interesting feature of the vacuum gravity, which is all around us, but it's so minute, and you have to have special experiments to detect it. A special feature of it is that it produces a repulsion. And so I thought to myself when I had this idea, wait a minute, if there's an outer shell of galaxies, and if indeed I take into account the vacuum gravity from the center, which is nearby, to this outer shell of galaxies, I wonder if I could actually work out the mathematics in such a way that it would give me an explanation for the Hubble redshift relation. And it took me a couple of years to do this, but indeed, it turns out that indeed I was able to show mathematically, that indeed I was able to account for the Hubble redshift relation. Then what about the cosmic blackbody radiation? Well, it turns out that indeed, if you have this vacuum gravity between us and this outer shell, you can redshift that radiation from out there to get what? The cosmic blackbody radiation. It is pure blackbody radiation. It is within the enclosure, which is standard physics, and it all begins to fit together. Well, years were involved, of course, in doing the mathematics and all of this, and I tried from time to time to actually get this published. And go ahead, you had a question?
Yeah, my question is, if you say there's a closed shell,
yeah,
and you're explaining the forces, and you also say there's expansion, do you believe that galaxies are actually moving then away from a center?
Yes.
And so what happens when they get to the outer shell? Do they smash into it?
That's a very, very good question. I'm glad you asked it because, you know, we're dealing with distances that are really vast, meaning that right now it appears from the Hubble Space Telescope and so forth, the galaxies that we can actually see with Hubble are at least 10 billion light years away, okay? Now, as the galaxies are moving out, yes, they are expanding because the gravitational repulsion of the vacuum is actually aiding them moving out.
Okay.
But how far are they going to move in a
Right.
day or a week or a year? No matter how fast they're going, compared to the vast distances of the universe, the fact of the matter is it's like God created it this way because they're on their journey, but in terms of actually seeing anything move outward, you can't.
So in other words, your answer to my question is that the universe is so vast that they're not going to run into something.
Absolutely. So anyway, this outer galactic shell then, well, I put together then all this information, wrote up a report and so forth, sent it in for publication, tried over and over and over again. And the referees, when they would get this information, look at it and see, you know, new model, center of the universe and everything, and those papers would just come back and come back and come back. I would answer every single referee objection about the actual mathematics and the physics of it, and they would just make up this, make up that. And anyway, that's why I had to go to presenting material at the APS, American Physical Society meetings, because since I'm a member of the APS, they have to let me in the door, so to speak. In other words, they have a policy. They will not censor any APS member from presenting a paper or a poster at these APS meetings.
Okay.
So that's the path I was taking while I was also working toward, of course, getting a paper published. In 1997, a paper really was published in the Modern Physics Letters A. And it basically outlined this new model, outlined in particular the new explanation of the redshifts, basically that it really was Doppler. And that indeed I raised the questions about the center of the universe, and I said, you know, if there is a center and if there's a Doppler interpretation, and then I outlined in brief form, you know, this new model of the universe.
With the
outer
shell. With the shell.
Absolutely.
And you marshaled the mathematical evidence
That's
for
right.
that.
That's right.
And that's what you mean when you say David and yourself in your research showed that.
Well, that was just the first
Okay.
crack out of the box, so to speak. Obviously, things were progressing to the point where indeed we felt, you know, it was time to even go more. And so as produce more, and we've already seen that indeed the cosmic black body radiation now refers to this uniform reference frame for the universe, and there's a reason for that. We talked about it before in the sense that indeed it is now going to be connected with, you know, something very, very important with respect to the universe, which we're going to see, of course, is the throne itself.
The center.
The center, that's right. All right, so, but we need to focus very, very briefly on the fact that this new model of the universe, which I published in 1997 in Modern Physics Letters A, showed or invoked this cosmological constant. It invoked, as a basis of this new model, vacuum energy, vacuum gravity. Now, this issue of Science magazine, the cover that you're seeing up there, first part of 1998, a couple of months after, actually only a month or so after I published the paper, what happens, but Science magazine comes out with reports that astronomers, in looking at the universe, have decided they have found very, very good evidence for what? The vacuum energy. The galaxies are indeed moving apart, moving outward in a different way than they had expected before. And so just very briefly, it talks about, in this graphic, this reservoir of energy fueling that force could be anything from a quantum mechanical shimmer in empty space called the cosmological constant to even more exotic possibilities. This particular issue of Science then referred to the fact that indeed they were finding evidence for this vacuum energy, which I had the previous month already used to establish this new model of the universe. Anyway, exploding stars point to a universal repulsive force. Remember a few minutes ago I said the vacuum energy would cause a repulsive force. Well, that's exactly what we see there in this article in 1998, first part of it. I had used in 1997 to build this new model of the universe.
So this was validating what you had posited.
It's validating it in the sense that, indeed, I built a new model of the universe based on this vacuum gravity, and indeed, a month later, it was actually found.
Okay.
And so, yes, you would think, you know, all things being equal, that if a person, a scientist, you know, actually makes a discovery, and then the essence of the discovery for a new model of the universe has merit enough so that, you know, it would come to the attention of the scientific community, then indeed, you know, this would be newsworthy within the scientific community, attention would be attracted to it to go and investigate this new model of the universe. However, this did not happen. And so I continued to work, and what happened then as I continued to work is that I finally got to the place of saying, well, yes, there are properties of this new cosmic model. I tried to write up new reports and send them in for publication. And
based on the fact that what you had suggested was shown to be true.
That's correct.
And you said, let me follow up on that and connect the dots for you so you can see and then maybe make a good decision. At least good in your book.
That's right. In other words, the very fact of the matter is, you know, by following this up, it turns out that the new model was able to explain not only the Hubble redshift relation, this cosmic black body radiation, but 8 or 9 of the other major incidents.
And we want to click through those, right? What you had come up with would have explained no cosmological principle, that problem that we had originally talked about. It would explain a nearby cosmic center, which was really the logical conclusion of the Doppler effect,
right,
which Hubble discovered. And it would explain the temperature variation of the cosmic black body radiation with the redshift. And what else did it would explain?
Well, there are others here, of course, the high Z supernova, that's a little bit technical. It must account for Olber's paradox, and this new model did all of that. Must obey conservation of energy, which it does. Must explain the distant galaxy's velocity dipole distribution. This, again, is rather technical. But in any event, what we're basically saying is that this new model of the universe was doing all sorts of things.
Explaining all types of things.
Should have attracted the attention of astronomers, cosmologists, astrophysicists around the world. And indeed, instead of me being able to get this information out to the scientific community, there is, as we're going to see, an effort, of course, to put the screws on it. Yeah, just and so
because I mean, to be honest, it's probably because of the association with the idea of the center of the universe, the idea that what the Bible says is true, and all those different things, and people just don't want to go there as scientists. They're not interested in the implications of it. They'd rather have perhaps something that doesn't explain 10, 12, 15 very important things than the other.
Well, I believe that is an important part. The other part is, of course, that the people who are not interested are the people who are making their livings, their reputations, careers, everything else is associated with their position as advocates of the Big Bang. Mm-hmm. So all of a sudden, discoveries are made, no Big Bang expansion, center of the universe, instead of, you know, just everything being the same everywhere. This is, and the evidence, as we've seen, you know, if you look carefully, it's there for a lot of people to have seen. Mm-hmm. Of course, I attribute whatever insight I've had to an answer to prayer.
So as a result of it not getting out, you're going public, you're trying to help people know about it, and you have developed a website that puts the very technical information for people that really want to look closely. That I read some of the abstracts, and I can assure you that it's technical. It has all the mathematics and different things, and it's right there. It's the same papers that have the fact that, you know, that they were accepted by that email. What's that server? That
archive.
That archive. They accepted they got the papers. They gave you a number and said, we see it, and they were about ready to send it out, but then they didn't. So you have all those there. People can read them. They can get the information. They can see how all these problems are solved, and it's out there.
Yes. Let me just go through very, very quickly. These 10 papers.
These are the titles.
That's right. Part 1 is the scientific community in for a big surprise.
Okay, and this first paper then showed, hey, look, there's problems with the Big Bang. We need to look at it. In for a big surprise.
That's right. The next one.
And then the next one was? is the scientific community aware of the extraordinary confusion over Big Bang's expansion redshifts? And of course, some of them are. I mean, you document that, but largely people that are coming into the in-shoot of science, the graduate students, the others, they're not aware of it, and so you're letting them know what it took you years to discover.
Absolutely. The very fact is, you know, what I do in that particular paper is to quote one authority versus another authority and show, of course, they don't even agree.
And the third one was galaxies point to flaws in Big Bang's expanding balloon illustration, and that's what we just covered earlier. The one with the balloon with the pennies on it doesn't make sense that the pennies wouldn't expand as the balloon did. And then the fourth one, tell us about that one.
Well, that's what we've already talked about. Space-time expansion requires wavelengths to expand. Then indeed, if there was a Big Bang fireball, all these photons, you know, they had to expand, it lost energy, and indeed 30 million times the mass of the universe is what the gargantuan non-conservation of energy losses would have been.
And the next one, number 5.
Oh, that's the one that we don't have time to delve into right now. The relativistic operation of the GPS exposes a fatal flaw in Big Bang's cornerstone expansion hypothesis or postulate. Basically what it amounts to is that the operation of the global positioning system depends on general relativity. General relativity is what they say, it's the solution of the field equations, is what they say is behind this space-time expansion. So general relativity then, the kind they were using, says a certain prediction should be occurring as a result of the operation of the global positioning system. David and I looked at the operation of the global positioning system, and we found that it doesn't fit the space-time expansion paradigm at all. It fits the static space-time expansion back in 1917, the one that Einstein
came up with. So it fits that, and it also fits your model of the universe that has some kind of border to it. Okay.
And it conserves energy.
All right.
Conserves energy.
That's number 5. And all of the research is right there. The number 6, the ultimate disproof of the Big Bang comes from its bizarre prediction that photons are prematurely inscribed with H's value at time of origin. I don't explain all that.
All right,
understand all
very
that.
quickly.
Okay.
Very quickly. You have a memory. I have a memory because we have a memory bank, okay? Now, if I tell you, though, that these light particles, photons, are coming from these lamps right here or anywhere else in the universe, if I tell you that one of us comes from there to here, and it has a memory of when it was formed, and it retains that memory, and it's going to change now depending on when it was formed. Pardon me. In other words, let's put it this way. The theory, which no one else had discovered before we wrote this particular paper, was that the photons that were formed back at the Big Bang, in order to fulfill exactly what Big Bang has to say, they have to remember when they were formed, what the value of the Hubble constant was at the time they were formed. Then they've got to change wavelength from that time to this time right here, knowing how far back it was when they formed. No one else had ever discovered this before, and that's what this particular paper is all about. In fact, that's a paper which I have on the CERN archive as well. And again, nobody's saying anything about it.
Okay, number 7 then. Discover of a nearby universal center is a smoking gun signature of Genesis, in other words, your model of the universe.
That's right.
That overturns Big Bang's cosmological principle. Okay.
In other words, you got a center. There is a specific place in the universe. The universe is not the same everywhere. And indeed, I go through the evidence there showing there is this nearby center. And then this is something to do, a technical point, where basically
Genesis is strongly affirmed because its MZ, delta, theta, Z, and apparent brightness relations are consistent with observations.
In other words, there are predictions that, you know, you look out in the universe and you see the brightness of a galaxy at a certain redshift. Okay. Well, there are things that determine or relate to that depending on the model of the universe you have. You look at the prediction, then you look at the actual observation.
So you just go through those and document how it answers those questions. Right. And then number 9, disproof of Big Bang cosmology points to 7 smoking gun signatures of Genesis astrophysical framework. So again, looking at other considerations.
Well, once you go through and show why the Big Bang is based on incorrect premises, then you can take the observational data, put it in the other framework, and show
see if
basically,
it works.
And show that indeed that it works. That's basically it.
And then
this one, absence of population 3 stars, prior discovery of short half-life, extinct primordial radioactivity, disprove Big Bang's nucleosynthesis scenario, and substantiates Genesis' rapid creation postulate. Population 3 stars are presumed to be the stars that form just of hydrogen and helium. They have never been found.
Okay.
And they should have been found. They've never been found. They keep asking why do we not see population 3 stars? And the extinct primordial radioactivity is the polonium halo evidence in the granite rocks.
Okay, so these 10, these big 10 are the ones that not only document your position, but then show, hey, what goes in place of it?
Right.
Don't take something away without putting something in place of it. And what you put in place of it is the center of the universe.
So we have then this evidence of the galaxies moving away, and there is a center. And what do we associate with the center? Psalm 11, the Lord is in his holy temple. The Lord's throne is in heaven. The Lord has established his throne in the heavens. His kingdom rules over all. We're associating then this center with the throne of God.
So that's looking now from the science, now moving to the authority of God's Word and saying, there's a center, and having that idea is not only scientific, but there are some things about God's Word that we want to look at now, and we want to say, hey, what is God's Word saying about this? And that's what we're going to look at in our next little segment here when we come back. So we're glad that you've joined us.